Hello, I'm Anthony. Welcome to the basic guide to automation in Cubase. Automation is simply a way of instructing Cubase to do something dynamically with our tracks in real time. It could be changes to volume control, it could be filter sweeps, any number of things that we can do, that we can write this information into the track and have Cubase play it back in real time. Hope you enjoy this one today, and if you do, check out the Patreon and channel member links below. It's an awesome way to help support my channel so that I can carry on making these videos. So let's make a start. We get to the automation lanes from the bottom left-hand corner of each track. There's this little drop-down button, and this displays our automation information. Now, there is no automation on this track at the moment. This blue line that you can see is the current volume level. So if I move the volume of this track, you can see that level going up and down. What I want to do is to change the volume of this track over the course of this looped section of song that I've got going. So I'm going to select my pencil tool and make this nice and big so that we can see what's going on. And I'm just going to draw a sine wave. That's automation data. That's all it is. It's changes in the volume, in this particular case, over time. Now, if I get the song running in the background, you can see in the mixer the volume going up and down according to these automation changes. Now, the frequency of all of these different automation changes is a configurable option. We'll have a look at that a little bit later. For now, I just want to get the handle of manipulating this data manually. Let's switch to the selection tool. I'm going to pick some of the data up. I'm going to go to the top of the selection zone, and now I can scale that data. As you can see, I can either move it, I can scale it, I can pick it up and move it somewhere else in the MIDI part. And now you can see that what's left behind is blank. There's no automation information in there. And Cubase intelligently knows that it needs to draw a line between those two automation points, and it'll actually track the volume coming down as we go. Now that I've just dropped the automation there, we now have a new automation curve. If I want to put it back, I'm going to have to undo. Otherwise, the stuff underneath would have been overwritten. Let's just make this MIDI part a little bit smaller so that I can show you what happens when we duplicate the MIDI part. The automation gets copied as well. Now, this is another configurable option. If we have a look in the toolbar at the top of the application, there's a button called Automation Follows Events. It's also in the edit menu here. When that's enabled, you get this behavior. Anything that happens with the event data, and in this case, we're talking about MIDI parts, the automation is going to track with it. So if I pick this MIDI part up and move it a couple of bars, you can see that the automation follows, and we draw an automation line in between those two zones. If I want to decouple the MIDI part from the automation, I disengage Automation Follows Events, and now they can move separately. I can always link them back up again, and then the MIDI part can pick the automation back up again, and here we are, walking hand in hand. If I delete the MIDI part, the automation will stay behind. Automation is written on the track. This is fundamentally important to understand, and a big difference between MIDI data, which we're not talking about today, but is closely related. And if you're in the area of automation, you'll very often come up against MIDI CC data particularly as well. But pitch bend, aftertouch are also examples of MIDI data. All of that's stored in the MIDI part. It's very important not to get too confused between MIDI and automation. Today we're dealing with automation. Another important distinction between MIDI data and automation is that MIDI is a global standard, whereas automation is DAW specific. So what we're dealing with here is Cubase automation. This is how Cubase have elected to interact with the plugins that it hosts. And this is part of the VST standard. Plugins write code in order to speak to Cubase automation. So let's see how that happens. I'm going to show you two examples today of how plugins communicate with Cubase. And firstly, we're going to use this running resource plugin, which is a Moog Modular V by Arturia. Let's have a listen to this sound on its own so that we know what we're talking about. So that's the Moog Modular. Let's play with the filter frequency and resonance. Okay. So now you've got an idea of what those two different controls do from the perspective of their tonal shape. Now let's automate those controls. I want to basically write some automation data into the track to modulate the cutoff and resonance dynamically. It's labeled frequency, but it's a filter cutoff. The first thing to do is drop down our automation lane. You'll see volume, but you won't see anything to do with these filter controls because they haven't been mapped into Cubase yet. Well, they have behind the scenes, they're just not visible. In order to make them visible, the easiest way to do it is to engage write automation on the track, little W symbol here, it'll turn red. Get the song going and move the controls with your mouse. Just a little nudge will do, same with resonance. And then we can stop the song. That's by far the easiest way to set up automation lanes. You can actually configure these things manually. There's a huge menu when you go into the More option. Let me just do that a little bit more slowly. So if I drop down the selection for what this automation is currently mapped to, and I select More, then if you find the plugin, the track name, running resonance, then it'll be configured differently. So this is different for each plugin. In this particular case, we would have to drill into the filter menu, filter one, and there they are. So you can manually assign these things, but you really don't need to very often because it's so much easier to do it from inside the plugin. So now that we've got these tracks, we can shut the plugin down. We don't need that anymore. We've just created some automation data. And in fact, if we played back the song over those two little bumps, you'd hear that change. That was a filter sweep then, a tiny little filter sweep. We could now manipulate this automation data in exactly the same way that we did with volume data. Pick it up, move it wherever we want, scale it, do any number of things with it. If I pick up the last node and drag that around, that's going to set the new kind of end target where the cutoff will rest after all of the automation's completed. I can select all of this information, copy it into my clipboard, and then jump around various points in the song, pasting that in to draw new automation curves. This is actually a very good way of very quickly setting yourself up with kind of potentially interesting new automation curves. If I choose the scale option and kind of drag those out so that they're a little bit wider separated, you can actually pull it down vertically and then scale it up, and you can, kind of carry on stretching the thing. And then copy them back into my clipboard, and off we go again, pasting that automation, and that will sound like this. So that's the filter control being wiggled backwards and forwards over time. How is that automation information being played back? When I press play, we're just hearing all of this stuff. It's because we have read automation engaged. The moment I created any automation on this track, read was enabled by default. It isn't there to start with when you have a look at all of the other tracks. They're not read automation enabled because there's no automation on them. But the moment you create any automation, read will be activated. If I disable read automation and play that thing back again, we'll have a look at the plugin because you can actually see when automation's being processed, you can actually see the knob moving, but of course in this case you won't because I've just disabled it. If I re-enable read automation, there's the knob being moved in the background virtually. Let's head into the automation panel. Here we are. Now, even though it looks like there's loads of stuff going on here, there really isn't. Basically, everything underneath these headings you can kind of ignore to start with. There's really not very much exciting going on. It looks like there's loads of functions, but they're really pretty straightforward. If I get that volume automation visible, where's the other track? There it is. So this is the volume automation that we recorded earlier. Most of these buttons are just filters to allow you to show or hide different kinds of automation data. So if I click the volume button, for instance, now only volume automation is visible, and the stuff that we recorded for the filter control in running resonance have disappeared. They're actually classed as inserts. So if I click the inserts button, then they get shown and the volume disappears. I very rarely use those filters. I like to see everything all of the time, quite frankly. And we do that by right-clicking on the tracks, and we say either show all used automation, which is really useful for just getting rid of any chaff in your project. You might have created automation lane and not yet written any automation to them. That's a great way to clean the interface. Or another option, I'll just hide everything so that the option appears to me. You can say show automation and that will show everything. You can create as many automation lanes as you want. I'm not aware of a limit. I'm sure there is one, but it'll be absolutely massive and far more than you would ever use just by clicking this little plus button. And at the moment it's assigning basically from a pick list. It's just running down this list and creating them randomly. But once you've created one of these automation lanes, you can then go in, manually configure it to whatever you want. As I said earlier, the vast majority of the time, you'll create those automation lanes from inside the plugin itself. Now, the reason I opened this automation panel isn't to tell you the stuff that isn't particularly interesting. It's to talk about these controls at the top because they are pretty useful. So we have two primary options that you're going to want to spend the vast majority of your time playing with: touch and auto latch. Crossover is a weird hybrid, and I would say certainly for beginners, avoid it. And frankly, from my own personal perspective, I never use crossover automation. It's a hybrid combination of these two features. So let's have a look at the more interesting ones. Touch and auto latch are for use with physical hardware. Now, there are fairly large sections of the application that I would need to describe in quite comprehensive detail, particularly quick controls and MIDI remote, because you need to configure your hardware in order to get this stuff running. I'm going to presume you're at the stage where you have a hardware device. I'm going to use my keyboard for this example, and there's a physical control that does something on that keyboard. In my case, I have a knob that's assigned to some quick controls. Basically, it just allows me to interact with plugins from a physical control. Let me demonstrate what I mean, and then we can get on to talking about touch and auto latch. I'm going to put it into write automation because I'm going to record some automation information now, and I'll get the song running in the background. Now, when I move this control on my keyboard, I'm basically turning a controller knob forwards and backwards, and you can see that I'm writing auto information. Now, watch what happens when I let this control go. Okay, so that's my hand coming off the control now. No more automation gets written. But what happens if we have automation at the other end of the part? How do we want to interact with those two automation areas? Give myself a bit of more room to play with. I'm going to add a bit more automation now. Once again, the moment I let go of the automation knob, it stops writing automation. But more importantly, the region that I didn't perform any editing on, because I'd stopped the song by this point, or I'd stopped automation, that's left exactly as it was. So touch automation only records automation in live mode when you're physically touching the control. That's why it's called that. In auto latch, however, it will carry on, it will stick at the last used value, and it will carry on overwriting automation for as long as I let the song run. So if I get the song running in the background, I'll wait for it to get to this flat bit and then start wiggling this control. Now I'm going to put it quite high and then let go. And now that final resting point, wherever I left the control, that's latched. That's an auto latch. And now it will carry on its overwriting automation as we speak until I press stop, and that process finishes. Realistically, or at least in my experience anyway, those are the only two automation options you need. Crossover is a curious hybrid between the two, where you've kind of got most of an auto latch process until you kind of flick the control through the previous known value and it stops recording automation. I don't use it personally, so I'm not going to speak from any experience. The next thing for us to have a look at is the trim function. This operates on volume. So I've brought up the richness track here where we have our volume automation. Now, if you want to perform trim operations on the track, you'll need to engage write automation because we're making a change to the volume automation. So engage write mode, then click the trim button. And this horizontal line appears representing effectively like a mask. Think of it like a mask over the top of the automation. That I can now manipulate this automation without actually changing the underlying data. And this is how we do it. The first thing that you want to do is select your select tool, not your draw tool. If you have your draw tool enabled, you're actually going to be editing the underlying automation. You see I've just changed the volume automation there. That's not what we want to do. You want to select your select tool. And the reason I mention it is because when you come over the line on the trim function, it turns into a pencil, which is bad iconography because it's very confusing as to which tool you're supposed to select. You need the select tool. With the select tool in pencil mode, believe it or not, click the trim curve. You've just created a trim node. If I now pick up that trim node by hovering over it, here's my hand. Can you see the volume going up and coming back down again? I'm adjusting the overall automation for the entire curve. I can't do this from the mixer. If I try to increase the volume on the mixer, see, it just snaps back into place because there's automation there. But the trim curve allows me to make that adjustment and then potentially audition that new automation and think, that's the way I like it. I'll show you how to lock it in place a little bit later. Let's just carry on having a look at trim for the moment. I'll select a new place on the trim curve and click again. Now I've just created a second trim node. So if I pick up the first one and drag it low and the second one and drag it higher, you can see the morphing that's been undertaken on the volume automation. So now if I play this piece, so here's the pad sound getting quieter. This is its minimum volume. Just jump forward. Oh no, I'll let this run actually. So it's going to get a little bit louder and then start going quieter. And now the volume is actually going to hold static because the automation's coming down, but the trim curve's going up. And then we sweep through this volume automation curve that was already on an upstroke, but the trim has pushed it further. So anything that's happening gets stretched. Now you can see these higher automation peaks are louder than they would have been had the trim not been there. I can disable trim and get back to my original automation. And if it plays back now, you'll hear the original automation curve. So if you audition the track and you think, you know, those volumes are really what I want, I'm quite happy with that now, rather than having to manually edit all of those automation nodes, drop this little arrow down and say freeze trim automation of selected tracks. That stuff then gets baked in. That is now the actual automation. The trim curve's been flattened out. We don't need it anymore. We can throw it away. And here's our automation that we've decided that we want. We've auditioned it, and now that's actually the real automation. It's a really, really useful tool for dynamically adjusting your volume, clicking your track, clicking your trim curve as often as you want, creating new volume nodes, and then morph it as required. For the final demonstration today, I'm going to show you the other way that plugins interact with Cubase for automation purposes. When we had a look at the Moog modular earlier, we saw that when we went into our automation options, they were all pre-programmed. Here they all are, and I can kind of drill down into the section that I need and find the commands I want. Some plugins have so many controls that simply doesn't work, and an example of that is Omnisphere. Omnisphere has thousands of automatable parameters, far more than 512, and they're not all pre-configured in Cubase. In fact, synthesizers like Omnisphere, Halion is another example that are modular or dynamic in construction, simply can't be automated in that way. So the user has to tell Cubase what they're going to automate. So in this case, we're going to use, again, the filter example. So let's just have a quick listen to what we're playing with here. So this is the filter sound that we're hearing. And I want to have a play with this filter to dynamically automate it. But it's not as simple as it was when we were doing the process with the Moog modular. If I engage write automation for this track and get the track running in the background and twiggle the filter control, nothing happens. There's no inherent mapping. We have to do it ourselves. Now, the vast majority of the time, if you have plugins that aren't dynamically automated, you automate them via the right-click menu. So if we right-click on the filter cutoff, there'll be a feature. Every plugin is named slightly differently, but in this one, it's Enable Host Automation. If we select that, this single control in the entire vastness of Omnisphere has been mapped into Cubase. So now if I get it playing again and move this control, here's our filter automation. Just appeared in exactly the same way that it did with the Arturia one earlier. Here's the original automation that we wrote in by hand, remember? This is the section that we've just dynamically created with the plugin. Let's have a look in the automation menu to see what that looks like behind the scenes. So here's our Moog Mod Classic. The first 8 are pre-assigned. They're basically the master outputs of Omnisphere. The interesting one is this slot, A filter cutoff. That's the single parameter that we've assigned inside Cubase. And if we scroll down, we have 512 empty slots waiting for us to assign somewhere in Omnisphere. So that's just a heads up. Some plugins are automatically done. If they have a fixed set of parameters, they'll typically be defined for you and they're really easy. But in the bigger synths, like Omnisphere and Halion, you're going to need to do that yourself. And that'll do us for today. Hope you enjoyed the episode. Please hit like if you did. I'll see you again. Thanks very much.